In the quiet fall of 1984, under a sky washed with the amber hues of a Texas autumn, a young girl and her father set out from their home in Austin for what was meant to be a simple weekend getaway. It was a father-daughter bonding trip, the kind that forms the core memories of childhood. They promised to be back by Sunday. But they never returned. As hours turned into days and days into weeks, the joy and laughter that once echoed through the Holbrook home were replaced with silence, sorrow, and an ever-deepening pit of unanswered questions. 16 years passed, with no sign, no clue, and no closure. For Margaret Holbrook, the wife and mother left behind, grief became a second skin, one she wore every day, heavy with the weight of loss and the torment of not knowing. But in the unlikeliest of places, a junkyard nestled in the dusty outskirts of San Marcos, something would be discovered that would breathe new life into a case long thought to be cold. Among rusted frames and piles of twisted metal, a clue would emerge, jagged and silent, destined to shatter everything Margaret had come to accept about her family's fate. The late afternoon sun bathed the Holbrook living room in a golden glow. It filtered through gauzy curtains, casting lattice-like shadows that danced gently over the polished hardwood floors. Margaret sat rigidly on her well-worn floral sofa, the fabric faded from years of use and sunlight. Her hand gripped the TV remote tightly, knuckles white. The silence was broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the subtle creak of the ceiling fan turning above. Beside her, perched with the quiet stillness of someone who had done this far too many times, was Doris, her mother, aging and fragile, yet anchored by a stubborn will. Her face was a tapestry of etched lines and weariness, a reflection of too many years spent waiting for a miracle that never came. "It's almost time," Margaret whispered, her voice no louder than a breath. She raised the volume on the television. The screen flickered to life, the local evening news program beginning with its familiar jingle. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes locked on the screen as if by sheer will she could summon an answer. Every year, on this exact date, she paid local stations to air the same missing persons segment. It was her ritual, her way of shouting into the void, just in case someone, somewhere, had seen something. The commercial ended, the broadcast faded into a somber report. On screen appeared a photograph, one that never failed to send a pang through Margaret's heart. A man with a thick mustache and warm, kind eyes stood beside a bright, somed little girl with a toothy grin. Her hand was clasped in his, both of them beaming in front of a striking red 1979 Cadillac DeVille. The image froze time, captured joy, and now served as a haunting reminder. 16 years ago today, James Holbrook and his 8-year-old daughter Lucia vanished without a trace during a routine weekend road trip, the anchor narrated solemnly. They were last seen driving a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille license plate THB 143. If you have any information regarding their disappearance, please contact the Austin Police Department immediately. Margaret clicked off the television before the segment finished. The abrupt silence that followed was heavier than any sound. She turned to Doris, who remained motionless, her eyes glossed with tears that never fell. "I'll go freshen up," Doris murmured, giving her daughter's hand a squeeze before rising slowly. Her steps were deliberate as she made her way up the stairs, the weight of 16 years dragging behind her like chains. Alone, Margaret stood and moved to the tall bookshelf lining the far wall. Her fingers drifted across the worn spines until they landed on a leather-bound photo album. She pulled it down, treating it with the reverence of a sacred relic. Back on the sofa, she opened it carefully. Inside, life from before the tragedy unfolded in captured moments. Jim with his prized Cadillac, Lucia grinning on her first day of school, the three of them at Barton Springs, soaked in sunlight and smiles. She traced Lucia's face with her fingertip, voice trembling. "Where are you?" It was a question she had asked 1,000 times, but the answer never came. The shrill ring of the telephone jolted her. She slammed the album shut and rushed into the kitchen. "Hello?" she answered, her voice tight with nerves. "Mrs. Holbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department," came the reply. Margaret's heart stuttered. "We've just received a report. Some potential evidence has surfaced at a junkyard in San Marcos. We believe it may be connected to your husband and daughter's disappearance." Her free hand clutched the kitchen counter. "What kind of evidence?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't share details over the phone, but we'd like you to come identify it. We can have a patrol car at your home in about 10 minutes, if that's all right." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes. I'll be ready." She hung up and ran to the stairs. "Mom," she called. "The police found something. They think it's connected to Jim and Lucia." Doris appeared at the landing, her face pale and stunned. "What did they say?" "I didn't, just that it's at a junkyard in San Marcos. They're sending a car." Doris descended the stairs with a speed Margaret hadn't seen in years. "I'm coming with you." They stood in silence, barely breathing, until a police cruiser pulled up outside. Officer Martinez introduced himself and opened the back door for them. The hour-long drive south was thick with unspoken fears. Margaret stared out the window at the familiar Texas landscape, mesquite trees, roadside diners, and the occasional tumbleweed, her thoughts spiraling through every possibility. Doris sat with her purse clutched in her lap, her face unreadable. At last, they arrived at Harrow's Auto Salvage. The place reeked of rust and motor oil. Yellow crime scene tape flapped in the wind, and multiple police vehicles formed a grim perimeter. Martinez guided them through the scrapyard's labyrinth of wrecked vehicles until they reached a knot of people. "Detective Reyes?" he called out. "Mrs. Holbrook and her mother are here." A tall man in plain clothes turned to greet them, his face solemn but respectful. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, I'm Detective Reyes. Thank you for coming on such short notice." "What did you find?" Margaret asked, her voice firmer than she felt. Without a word, Reyes stepped aside, and there it was. Nestled between twisted piles of metal and half-buried in overgrowth was a red Cadillac DeVille, mangled and nearly unrecognizable, its once brilliant paint now dulled by decades of weather and time. But Margaret knew. Every inch of her body recognized that car. "Oh my God," Doris whispered, seizing her daughter's arm for support. Margaret stepped forward as if drawn by gravity. The world faded to a hush. Her heart thundered as she stared at the rusted ruin that had once been her husband's pride and joy, the vehicle he had lovingly polished every Saturday, the one that vanished with him and their daughter all those years ago. And now here it was, the ghost of a life stolen too soon. The vehicle had suffered significant damage, its frame partially flattened under the massive weight of a nearby hydraulic excavator. Its roof had caved inward, the windshield completely shattered, and much of the body had been twisted or crushed beyond easy recognition. What had once been a proud, gleaming red Cadillac now resembled little more than a mangled shell. Around the wreck, uniformed officers moved meticulously, capturing photos from every angle, measuring distances, and scouring the immediate vicinity for any clue, anything that might explain how it got there or what had happened inside it. Detective Reyes stood nearby, his expression softened with empathy. "We're not able to access the inside of the car, not in its current state," he said gently. "But before we proceed further, we need to confirm something very important. Mrs. Holbrook, do you believe this is the vehicle your husband was driving when he and your daughter disappeared?" Margaret inhaled sharply, her breath catching in her chest. She took a step closer, slowly circling the remnants of the car. Her eyes flicked over the collapsed roof, the rusted panels, the faded remnants of paint. It would be easy for someone else to overlook, to say this was just another crushed car in a junkyard full of forgotten wrecks. but to her, every inch of it was achingly familiar. When she reached the rear passenger side, her steps faltered. There, still faintly visible on the dented chrome of the right rear wheel cover, was a small but unmistakable dent. She crouched beside it, gently placing her fingers against the cold metal. "My husband hit a curb the week before he left," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We talked about getting it repaired, but we never got around to it." She stood, blinking rapidly to push back the tears threatening to spill. Turning to Detective Reyes, she nodded with conviction. "Yes, this is their car." Reyes nodded, his demeanor turning grim. He raised a hand and motioned someone forward. A man in oil-stained jeans and a faded flannel shirt approached, clearly uneasy. "Mrs. Holbrook," Reyes said, "this is Dean Lom. He owns the salvage yard and was the one who contacted us." Dean removed a rag from his pocket and wiped his hands nervously before extending one toward Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I had no idea that car had any kind of history like this. It was just another vehicle, scheduled to be scrapped first thing this morning. I only saw the missing person story on TV afterward, and that's when I recognized the car. I called you guys immediately." Margaret stared at his outstretched hand but didn't take it. "How did it get here?" she demanded. "Who brought it in?" Dean hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "That's the thing, ma'am. I don't know. I've no record of that car ever being checked into our system. It doesn't show up in our logs, our paperwork, nothing. It's like it just appeared." "That sounds more than a little suspicious," Doris interjected, her voice sharp with suspicion. Detective Reyes raised a calming hand. "Mrs. Barrett, Mr. Lame did the right thing by contacting us. We've got no indication so far that he had any involvement in the vehicle's disappearance or sudden appearance here. Impugned as you are," Dean added quickly, "we've got a strict intake protocol. Vehicles are always processed with ID, a title or scrap certificate, and logged into our digital system. I don't know how this one slipped through the cracks." As he spoke, a young woman in a grease-streaked jumpsuit and worn boots approached. She wiped her hands on her pant leg and spoke up. "I saw Reed bring it in." Every head turned toward her. "Reed?" Reyes asked, his tone sharpening. "Reed Caraway," Dean said. "He's my partner here. Handles the technical side of operations. Runs diagnostics, preps the cars for parts or crushing." Reyes pulled out his phone immediately. "We need to speak to him, now." "Beeper." Dean nodded and fumbled with his own phone, dialing quickly. After a few moments, he frowned. No answer. "It's going to voicemail." Waited. "I'll need his home address," Reyes said firmly. "Sure, I've got it," Dean replied, retrieving a weathered notebook from his back pocket and scribbling down an address. "He lives over in South Austin. Here." Reyes took the note and handed it off to a nearby officer. "Send a unit. Bring Mr. Caraway in for questioning." He turned back to Dean. "Is there anything else of his here that might be of interest?" "Just his office," Dean said. "But it's locked. Only Reed has the key." "We'll need a search warrant," Reyes stated, motioning to another officer to begin the process. Margaret barely registered the rapid-fire exchange. Her eyes remained locked on the crushed Cadillac, the ghost of her past. This car had carried away the two people she loved most in the world. For 16 years, she had imagined countless endings. Now, staring at this wreck, she wasn't sure which truth would hurt more. Reyes approached her once more. "Mrs. Holbrook, I know this is overwhelming, but if you and your mother are up for it, your help in identifying any personal items we might find could be invaluable." Margaret gave a mute nod, and she and Doris joined the officers in combing the yard. They sifted through endless piles of twisted metal, broken glass, and discarded remnants of forgotten lives. Hours slipped by, marked only by the shifting sun and the hum of insects in the warm afternoon air. Still, no trace of Jim or Lucia emerged. No clothing, no personal effects, no human remains. Eventually, the group made their way to the exterior of Reed Carraway's office. The metal door was locked tight, its handle worn and slightly rusted. Margaret leaned against the corrugated siding, her entire body aching with fatigue. Doris stood beside her, one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders, offering silent support. The sun had climbed high overhead when two marked police cruisers finally rolled into the yard. Behind them came a dark blue pickup truck that braked to a stop a short distance away. A man in his mid-20s stepped out. He had short-cropped brown hair and wore a work shirt with the Harrows Auto Salvage logo stitched onto the pocket. His face bore the confused look of someone caught in a storm he didn't see coming. "Mr. Carraway," Reyes called out as he approached. The man nodded cautiously. "Yeah, that's me." "What's going on? The officer said you needed to talk to me. Something about a car?" "I'm Detective Reyes," he replied, extending a hand. "We're investigating the sudden appearance of a red Cadillac on your property. It's linked to a 16-year-old missing persons case." Reed's brow furrowed and his eyes widened slightly. "You mean the one that got crushed this morning? Dean told me he called you guys about it." Reyes nodded toward the two women watching nearby. "This is Margaret Holbrook and her mother Doris Barrett. The car belonged to Margaret's husband, who disappeared with their daughter 16 years ago." Reed's expression shifted to solemnity. He walked over to Margaret and offered his hand. "I'm very sorry to hear that, truly." After a pause, Margaret took his hand, her grip steady despite her turmoil. Reyes continued, "The car wasn't entered into your system. One of your co-workers said she saw you bring it in. Can you explain how it ended up here?" Reed ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath. "Yeah, that was a strange situation. It was about a week ago. An older guy came by when Dean was out, said he had this old car, didn't need it anymore, and just wanted it destroyed. He didn't offer much explanation. I figured it was just another junk vehicle." "Did he give you his name?" Detective Reyes asked, his tone firm but calm. Reed shook his head slowly, his brow knitted in confusion. "No, and that's what was weird. He didn't act like someone trying to get away with something, just impatient. He paid cash, more than enough to cover processing, and I tried to get his name for our records, just like we always do. But before I could even grab a pen, he turned and walked away, didn't even look back." "You just walked off?" Reyes pressed. "Yeah," Reed confirmed. "Left the keys in the ignition. I called after him, even tried to follow him out toward the road, but the guy was gone, like he'd disappeared." Detective Reyes leaned in slightly. "Can you describe him in more detail?" Reed paused, squinting as he tried to recall the encounter. "Tall, maybe 6 feet, slim, kind of wiry build. His hair was gray, but I got the feeling it used to be darker, maybe brown, thick mustache, glasses. Wore khakis and a tucked-in button-up shirt. He spoke real soft, like he wasn't used to talking much. I had to lean in just to hear him." A sharp gasp broke the moment. Margaret turned to Doris, her face blanched with sudden realization. That sounds like Jim," she whispered, barely able to form the words. Doris's eyes widened. "What?" she said, louder than she intended. "That can't be." Detective Reyes looked from one woman to the other. "Mrs. Holbrook, are you saying this description matches your husband?" Margaret nodded, her fingers trembling. "It could be. The height, the build, the mustache. Jim always wore button-up shirts, even when he didn't have to." Reyes turned back to Reed. "How old did the man seem to you?" Reed scratched his chin. "Hard to say. Maybe in his 50s, but he looked tired, worn out. Could have been younger. There was something in his face, like he'd seen too much." Aurora shook her head, her voice tinged with disbelief. "None of this makes any sense. Jim loved that car. He babied it. He'd never just hand it over to be crushed. And why now? Why after 16 years? Margaret's voice joined hers, tinged with desperation. And where is Lucia? If it was Jim, why wouldn't he have come home, or at least contacted us? Detective Reyes raised a hand. Let's not jump to conclusions. I understand how difficult this is, but we need to take this one step at a time. Mr. Carraway, we'd like to search your office. One of your employees mentioned it's usually locked. Reed nodded. Yeah, sure. Nothing to hide. We keep tools, part inventories, repair logs, all kinds of stuff. I'll take you there. The group made their way across the junkyard, the heat pressing down as the afternoon sun bore down on them. Margaret and Doris exchanged uneasy glances, their thoughts spinning with uncertainty and fear. Do you really think it could be him? Doris asked in a whisper. I don't know, Margaret replied. It sounds like Jim, but if it is, then where has he been? And why hasn't he come back for us? Maybe this man is pretending to be Jim, Doris suggested, her voice trembling with unease. Maybe it's someone trying to confuse us, mess with the investigation. They followed Reed into the small building at the rear of the lot. He stopped at a heavy door and pulled out a ring of keys, locating the correct one before unlocking the door. Here we go, he said, stepping aside. It's not much, but it's all his. Please wait outside, Detective Reyes instructed Margaret and Doris. We'll let you know if we find anything relevant. Just as the officers began their search, Doris clutched at her chest, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. Mom? Margaret asked, alarmed. What's wrong? My asthma, Doris wheezed. I think distress. My inhaler. Margaret hurried to help her mother to a nearby bench. She rummaged through Doris's purse and found the inhaler buried at the bottom. She quickly handed it over and steadied her mother's shaking hand as she used it. After a few tense moments, Doris's breathing began to ease. I'm okay, Doris said at last, her voice raspy but firm. Just overwhelmed. I'm so sorry for the scare. Do you want us to call an ambulance? Reyes asked, having rushed over. Doris shook her head emphatically. No, I'll be fine. Just give me a minute to sit down. As Margaret continued to tend to her mother, the officers worked methodically inside Reed's office. Occasionally, one would emerge holding a small item or piece of paper, but each time, Margaret shook her head. Nothing they found belonged to Jim or Lucia. Nothing familiar. Nothing that offered answers. Nearly an hour passed before Detective Reyes stepped outside once again. We've completed our search, he said, his tone respectful but disappointed. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything directly connected to your husband or daughter. Marguerite's shoulders slumped, a sigh escaping her lips. So, we're still nowhere closer to the truth? Not quite, Reyes said, gently but firmly. Finding the Cadillac is a major development. Now we need to understand how and why it ended up here. There are leads to follow. Mr. Carraway, we'd like you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. Reed nodded immediately. Of course, anything I can do to help. Reyes turned to Margaret and Doris. We'd also appreciate it if you'd come. There are some case details we'd like to revisit in light of this new evidence. Margaret nodded. We'll come. I can drive myself, Reed offered. I was heading back toward Austin anyway. Reyes considered, then nodded. That's fine. We'll expect you there within the hour. As the group dispersed, Margaret helped Doris to her feet, gently supporting her as they walked toward the police cruiser. Are you sure you're okay? Margaret asked, concern etched into her features. Doris gave a weak smile and squeezed her daughter's arm. I wouldn't miss this for the world. If there's any chance we'll find out what happened to Jim and Lucia, I need to be there. They settled into the back of the cruiser, watching as Reed got into his blue pickup. The small convoy departed the junkyard, leaving behind the battered remains of the red Cadillac. The sun hung high, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched across the ground like memories refusing to fade. Later, under the fluorescent lights of a stark conference room at the Austin Police Department, Margaret and Doris sat across from Detective Reyes and another officer. The air was cool, the mood somber. On the table before them lay a thick file folder, edges worn from time and use. "Let's go through the timeline again," Reyes said, opening the folder. "Sometimes fresh eyes can reveal details we missed." Margaret nodded, her hands tightly clasped together. Jim and Lucia left on Saturday morning, October 12, 1984. Jim was a dentist. He had a practice here in Austin. Valentine. She paused, taking a slow breath as she collected her thoughts. He was well liked. Everyone at the practice loved him. Patients, staff, even the delivery guys. He never missed a day of work without a good reason. That's why it was so strange when they didn't come home. Doris added softly. He adored Lucia, took her everywhere he could. That trip was supposed to be their special weekend, just the two of them. The room fell quiet, the weight of 16 years of mystery thick in the air. Pages turned softly in the file as Detective Reyes prepared to listen once more. Somewhere beneath all the facts and fragments, Margaret hoped, there might still be a truth they hadn't yet seen. "He was well respected," Margaret began, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the weight of memory. "He built that practice from the ground up, every bit of it. It was his dream, and he made it real through hard work and long nights. He had a very particular way about him. His mustache, those bright, colorful ties. He had such a distinctive presence." She gave a soft, fond laugh that quickly faded. His patients adored him. Everyone in the office did. And Lucia. Detective Reyes leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle. "Tell us about Lucia." Margaret's lips curled into a small, wistful smile. She was 8, full of life, endlessly curious, always asking questions. She had this spark, like the world was her playground, and she loved her dad. She followed him everywhere when she wasn't in school, shadowed him at the clinic, watched him work. They were close, inseparable really. The second officer, pen poised above his notepad, asked, "And you didn't go on that trip with them?" Margaret shook her head. "No. My mom needed help that weekend. She was rearranging her place after my father passed, moving furniture, getting things in order. I promised Jim I'd catch up with them later, maybe meet them in town for dinner on Sunday." She sighed. It was supposed to be just a quick overnight trip. Jim wanted to take Lucia to Llano, show her the autumn leaves in the hill country, maybe take her to Enchanted Rock. He loved that place. They were going to be back by Sunday evening. Detective Reyes nodded slowly. And when did you first realize something was wrong?" Margaret's eyes dropped to the table. "Sunday night. Jim said he'd call when they left Llano, but he never did. By dinner I was worried. I tried calling the motel. They said he and Lucia had checked out that morning." She paused, her voice tightening. "I called everyone. His friends, his co-workers, even his cousin in Dallas. No one had heard from him. By Monday morning, I went to the police." Doris, seated beside her, reached over and took her daughter's hand. "We've been looking ever since," she said softly. Detective Reyes gave a solemn nod. The investigation was extensive for the time. We had officers reviewing surveillance from every gas station and roadside diner along the route. Motel staff were interviewed, locals questioned, but nothing. His bank account was never touched again, credit cards, no activity. His dental office remained untouched. The second officer added, "Technology was more limited back then. We didn't have widespread cell phone coverage or GPS tracking, fewer cameras, but we pursued every lead we could. And now, after 16 years, his car suddenly turns up in a junkyard," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "And it was brought in by a man who might be him." A tense silence settled over the room. Detective Reyes closed the file folder, folding his hands on the table. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Mrs. Holbrook, I have to ask this directly. Is there any chance, any possibility, that your husband left of his own accord?" Margaret flinched, the question cutting deeper than expected. "No, absolutely not. We had a happy marriage. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Jim loved our daughter more than anything. His business was thriving. He had no reason to disappear." Reyes gave a slow nod, as if bracing for resistance. "I understand, but sometimes people keep secrets, even from those closest to them. Hidden struggles, things we never imagine." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Not Jim, and even if there was something going on, he would never take Lucia, never." The tension was broken by a knock on the door. A uniformed officer stepped inside. "Reed Carraway's statement has been processed. He's waiting in the lobby." "Thank you," Reyes said, and the officer left. He turned back to the women. "We're going to continue pursuing this lead. The vehicle will be fully examined and will trace any possible movement over the last 16 years. In the meantime, I recommend you go home and rest. It's been a long day." Margaret glanced at her watch and blinked in surprise. "It's already after 2? Reyes stood, offering a hand. "We can have an officer drive you." They followed him into the station's main lobby, where Reed sat scrolling through his phone. He looked up and stood when they approached. "All done?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Thank you for cooperating." Reyes nodded. "For now. We'll be in touch if we need anything further." Reed looked from one woman to the other. "I can give you a ride if you'd like. I live over in Hyde Park, not far from here." Reyes frowned slightly. "That's not necessary, Mr. Carraway. We can arrange—" He was interrupted by another officer calling his name urgently. Reyes excused himself, stepping away to speak privately. Margaret looked at her mother, who looked pale and drained. She weighed their options: wait longer for an official ride, or accept the offer from a man they'd spent the day with under police supervision. "We'd appreciate the ride," Margaret said, making the decision. "You've been helpful and the police know where you work. It's fine." "I'll let Detective Reyes know," she added, walking over to where the detective was finishing up his conversation. Doris leaned close. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret nodded. "He's been honest so far. They've got all his information. It'll be okay." When she informed Reyes, he looked reluctant but nodded. "We've got his plate and his contact. If there's any issue, you call us right away." Reed's truck was older but well kept. He opened the passenger door for Doris and helped her climb in before Margaret slid into the middle seat. "We're in Hyde Park?" Reed asked as he pulled away from the station. "Speedway, near 45th, Margaret replied. "Small world. I'm on Avenue H, just a few blocks away. Funny we've never run into each other." Margaret offered a polite smile. "Thanks again for the ride." The drive through Austin was calm, the city unusually quiet that afternoon. Reed made light conversation, commenting on how the skyline had changed, the new shops on Lamar, how traffic had gotten worse over the years. Just as they neared Hyde Park, Doris suddenly gasped, her hand patting her coat and then her purse. "What's wrong, Mom?" Margareta asked, alarmed. "An inhaler," Doris said with growing worry. "I think I left it at the junkyard. Back when I had that attack, it might still be in Reed's office." Margaret's expression changed instantly. "We need to go back." Reed glanced in the rearview mirror, concern flickering across his face. "It's not a problem. I can take us back. It's only about 25 minutes from here." Margaret turned slightly to face her mother. "Do you feel okay? Can you manage without it until we're back?" Doris nodded slowly, though her hand trembled slightly. "I'll be fine if we go straight there. I hate not having it." Reed adjusted the truck's route with a smooth turn at the next light. We'll be back before you know it. I'll make sure we get in and out quickly." The ride turned silent, tension settling in the cab like a thick blanket. Margaret stared out the window, her mind churning. She couldn't help but think about what they had uncovered today. Jim's car, the strange man, Reed's role in all of it. Had they really found a piece of her husband's trail after all these years? And if so, what did that mean? She glanced at Reed, who kept his eyes on the road, his expression neutral but focused. He had cooperated with the police, answered every question without hesitation, and volunteered to drive them home. Still, part of her couldn't shake the gnawing discomfort in her chest. They drove past familiar landmarks now veiled in the haze of approaching dusk. The world outside looked unchanged, yet Margaret felt everything in her life had shifted. Again. As they neared the salvage yard, she reached into her purse and found her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, just in case. Reed noticed. "Don't worry," he said with a quiet voice. "We'll grab the inhaler and be on our way. No surprises." Margaret nodded, but said nothing. "Are you feeling okay?" Margaret asked, casting a concerned glance toward her mother in the truck's cab. "I'm all right now," Doris replied, catching her breath. "But I really need that inhaler. It's my prescription one, and I just picked it up last week. Not to mention, it wasn't cheap." Reed glanced at them in the rear-view mirror. "I have asthma too," he said casually. "If you're in a tight spot, I've got a backup inhaler at home. We could swing by and grab it." Margaret shook her head gently. "That's very thoughtful, Reed, thank you. But maybe we can just stop at a pharmacy. There's got to be one nearby." Doris shook her head. "It's a prescription inhaler, and I'd really rather not spend more money if mine is just sitting there at the junkyard. I'd rather go back and get it." Margaret looked at her incredulously. "You mean go back now? It's at least an hour away." "I don't mind the drive," Reed offered, already easing his foot off the gas. "Really, it's no trouble." Margaret hesitated. "We can't ask you to do that for us." Doris cut in firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "A taxi would cost a fortune, and Mr. Carraway is offering to help. Please, just call me Reed," he said with a friendly chuckle. "And I mean it. I don't mind. I know that junkyard better than I know my own kitchen. We can be there and back in a couple of hours." Margaret looked at her mother, her face lined with both fatigue and stubborn determination, then gave in with a sigh. "If you're sure." "I am," Dora said. "Let's go get it." Reed nodded and signaled a turn at the next intersection. "Back to San Marcos we go," he said with light-hearted cheer. The dashboard clock read 3:05 p.m. as they pulled into auto salvage once again. The police had already cleared out, but the crushed red Cadillac still sat beneath a tarp, roped off with yellow crime scene tape. A few employees worked in the background, lifting and stacking twisted bits of metal. All three climbed out and walked toward the front office. Behind the counter, Dean Lamb looked up, startled to see familiar faces. "Reed? Mrs. Holbrook? I thought you all left hours ago with the detectives." "We did," Reed explained, "but Mrs. Barrett thinks she may have left her inhaler here during the incident earlier." "Oh." Dean's eyes softened. "Oh, I saw it after everyone left. Figured it was important, so I put it in your office, Reed. Thought you'd know how to get it back to them." "That was very thoughtful," Doris said, relief in her voice. "It's my prescription. I'd hate to lose it." "No problem," Dean replied. "Reed's got the key." Reed nodded and pulled out his keys. Margaret and Doris followed him down the hall toward the office. "We'll just go in and grab it," Reed said, stepping through the door and shutting it behind him. Margaret sank into a chair in the hallway, her entire body sagging with exhaustion. Doris, still jittery, paced slowly near the entrance, her eyes fixed on the closed office. After a moment, Margaret asked, How are you holding up? Doris gave a weak smile. Just tired. A little shaken, but okay. The hallway was quiet save for the distant metallic clanks from the junkyard. Minutes passed. What's taking him so long? Margaret muttered. It's just an inhaler. Doris stopped pacing suddenly. Her face went tense. Margaret, she whispered urgently. When he opens the door again, look into the office. At the glass cabinet across from the doorway, top shelf. What? Why? Margaret asked, startled. I think I saw something when he went in, Doris whispered. A blue handbag between some books. It looked like Lucia's. Margaret's heart skipped. That's impossible. Lucia's bag was with her when they disappeared. Just look, Doris said firmly. It's the exact same blue. You'll know it when you see it. Before Margaret could say more, the door creaked open. Reed stepped out, inhaler in hand. Found it right on my desk, he said, handing it to Doris. But Margaret wasn't looking at the inhaler. Her eyes went straight to the interior of the office, past Reed, to the glass-fronted cabinet. And there it was, a small, sky-blue handbag nestled between thick technical manuals. Reed, she said, voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. That blue bag in your office. Reed turned to glance behind him. Oh, that? Just an old bag. Been there for years. His tone was casual, but his shoulders tensed. He looks exactly like my daughter's, Margaret continued. The one she had with her when she went missing. Reed hesitated. Really? That's strange. Must be a coincidence. Would you mind if I took a closer look? She asked, already rising. Reed paused, then shrugged. Sure, I guess. It belonged to my daughter, actually. Dean, who had come down the hall, raised a brow. I didn't know you had a daughter. Reed shot him a sharp glance. She doesn't live with me. She's with her mother down in Houston. He opened the door again and stepped inside, retrieving the bag from the cabinet shelf. Here it is, he said, handing it over. She got it for her birthday one year, but she never really liked it. Left it here, and I just kept it. Margaret took the bag slowly, her fingers tracing the worn edges. The fabric. The butterfly embroidery on the corner. Every stitch was familiar. Her mind reeled, memories crashing in like waves. Lucia on her birthday, proudly showing off her new handbag, declaring it was the same color as the sky when it's happy. Margaret's voice caught in her throat. This isn't just similar. This is Lucia's. Doris stepped beside her, eyes glassy. I knew it. I knew what I saw. Reed said nothing. Dean looked between them, his brow furrowed. You sure about this? Margaret nodded, barely able to speak. I want the police to see it. There could be something, DNA, fibers, something they can test. If it helps, Reed said, but his voice had gone tight, guarded. Margaret held the bag against her chest. It helps more than you think. As they turned to leave, a chill settled over her. Something in Reed's story didn't add up. She didn't yet know how. But the wall of mystery that had held for 16 years had just cracked wide open. Margaret took the handbag from Reed with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the humid Texas air. She stared at it, not quite believing what she was holding. It was the exact shape and size of the purse she had bought for Lucia back in 1984. A petite, rectangular handbag, pale blue with white trim and a rounded silver clasp that clicked when shut. It was delicate but sturdy, perfect for a little girl who wanted to feel grown up. Lucia had saved her allowance for that bag, skipping Saturday treats and choosing chores that paid better. She had proudly picked it out herself at a boutique shop downtown, clutching it with both hands on the ride home, declaring it grown-up enough for school and weekend adventures. Margaret remembered how Lucia refused to leave the house without it, even on the trip to the hill country with Jim, and now here it was, sitting in Reed Carraway's office, after 16 years. "This looks like a vintage piece," Margaret said softly, her voice distant as she turned the bag over in her hands. "What year did your daughter receive this?" Reed shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. A few years ago, maybe?" he said with a shrug, avoiding her gaze. Doris stepped closer, examining the bag with a critical eye. "It's identical to one that was popular back in the early 80s, she said, watching Reed closely. "I'm surprised they still make them like this. It's not a common design anymore." Reed chuckled uneasily, giving a dismissive wave. "You know how fashion is. Everything old comes back around. Vintage is trendy now." Margaret slowly opened the clasp, the metal releasing with a familiar pop. The interior was clean and empty, its fabric a pale peach that looked barely touched. She ran her fingers along the lining, searching for wear and tear, but it was almost pristine. "It's in remarkably good condition for a child's bag," she observed. "She didn't really use it," Reed said quickly. "Didn't like the color or something. I just kept it in here. Thought maybe I'd give it to Goodwill eventually." "You'd give away your daughter's birthday present?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Reed shrugged again. "She's not missing it. Besides, if it brings you comfort, I don't see the harm." "That's very generous," Margaret said slowly, not quite sure what to make of his tone. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Reed replied, but something in his eyes made Margaret uneasy. Doris took the bag and turned it over in her hands. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted a small tag stitched into the lining near the inner seam. "There's no brand information on this," she murmured. "Just a white ribbon tag. Looks like it used to have text, but it's been worn away, or maybe scrubbed out." Margaret leaned in to look. The tag had faint traces of faded ink, like something had once been printed, but had since disappeared. "That's odd," she said, her heart beginning to race. "Most items like this would have at least a brand or year of manufacture." Reed's smile thinned. "Maybe it was a knockoff. I don't know. It was a gift from someone at her school." Margaret frowned. She knew that tag. She'd seen it every time she cleaned Lucia's bag or helped her organize her things. This was not a copy. This was the same purse. The fabric, the trim, even the faint stain near the seam where Lucia had spilled apple juice one spring morning. It was all there. She looked at Doris, who nodded subtly, clearly thinking the same. "We'll keep it," Doris said, clutching the bag tightly to her chest. "If you're sure it's okay." "Like I said," Reed repeated, "just gathering dust." Reed gestured toward the hallway. "If there's nothing else, I'll get you two back to Austin. Should beat the evening traffic if we leave now." The three of them walked back through the junkyard, Margaret and Doris exchanging glances loaded with meaning. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the rusted metal and stacked car frames. Once they were back inside the truck, Reed stepped out briefly to talk to Dean. In his absence, Doris leaned in close. "It's Lucia's bag," she whispered. "I'm sure of it. That tag. It was tampered with. The brand and year were removed." Margaret's eyes were locked on the bag in her lap. "I know. I felt it in my bones the moment I touched it." "But how did he get it?" Doris asked. "Why was it in his office? And why be so willing to give it away?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But it's not a coincidence. First Jim's car, now Lucia's bag. Both tied to Reed." "Do you really think he's involved?" Doris asked. "I don't know what to think," Margaret replied, "but we have to find out." Reed returned to the driver's seat with a smile. "All set?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice even. "Thank you again for your help." Reed started the engine, and the truck rolled out of the salvage yard. They merged back onto Interstate 35, heading north toward Austin. The sun now hovered just above the horizon, casting a golden glow across the open Texas plains. Margaret sat stiffly, the blue handbag clutched in her lap like a talisman. Her fingers traced the seams, the familiar curve of the clasp, the texture of the fabric she knew as well as her own skin. Every stitch brought back memories. Doris sat behind her, silent and pale, her inhaler now safely stowed in her purse, but her mind clearly elsewhere, turning over possibilities, sifting through fears. The ride was quiet until Reed spoke. "That car," he said casually, "must have been quite a shock. 16 years, and then, boom, out of nowhere." Margaret nodded. "It was more than a shock. It's the first real lead we've had in over a decade." Reed glanced at her. "Tell me about them." "Jim and Lucia. What were they like?" Margaret hesitated. His tone was polite, but something about the question felt rehearsed. Still, talking about Jim and Lucia always brought a strange comfort, and if there was even a chance Reed knew more than he was saying, perhaps her words would stir something. "Jim was a dentist. He opened his own practice just after we got married. He had a gift with children. He'd make them laugh, show them how to brush properly, even sing little songs about flossing. He wore these ridiculous ties, some with dancing teeth, some with toothbrush patterns." Reed chuckled. "Sounds like a fun guy." "Diking tombra sepe." "What's that?" Margaret said softly. "And Lucia. She was a spark. Always curious. She'd spend hours reading science books, asking questions no one could answer. One week she wanted to be a paleontologist. The next, a marine biologist. She loved puzzles, anything with mystery." Reed nodded slowly. "Sounds like you had a beautiful family." "We did," Margaret whispered. "We still do, no matter how long it's been." Her grip tightened around the purse, as though willing the answers to rise from its seams. Margaret smiled softly as she recalled her daughter's impeccable sense of style, even at such a young age. "Lucia was a little fashionista," she said, her voice filled with warmth and nostalgia. "She was only 8, but she cared deeply about what she wore, how her hair looked, and whether her shoes matched her bag. That little girl had more opinions about color coordination than I ever did." Reed glanced over, then nodded toward the handbag still resting in Margaret's lap. "Is that why she loved that blue bag so much?" Margaret gently stroked the vinyl surface with her fingers, as if touching a part of Lucia herself. "Yes," she said, her tone tender. "She saved up her allowance for weeks to buy it. It was part of the Barbie accessory collection. Limited edition, if I remember correctly. She spotted it in a toy catalog and made a whole plan to get it." Doris, seated quietly in the back seat, added, "She even kept the tag from it, told me she'd save it forever." "She brought it everywhere," Margaret said, a faint smile flickering across her face. "Even to church. I told her it didn't match her Sunday dress once, and she looked at me like I'd said something blasphemous. She said, 'Mom, it matches my soul.'" The warmth of the memory faded as Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. She offered it forward. This was taken about a month before they vanished. The photo depicted Jim and Lucia in front of the red Cadillac. Jim, tall and handsome with his signature mustache and a vibrant tie, had his arm wrapped around Lucia. She stood smiling in a bright pink outfit, her tiny hands gripping the blue handbag that now rested in Margaret's lap. "She's adorable," Reed said, offering only the briefest glance at the photo before returning his eyes to the road. Wasn't she missing her 2 front teeth then? And that shirt? Pink, with a rainbow on it? Margaret's hands stilled as she returned the photo to her purse. Her breath caught. He couldn't have seen those details from the photo, not at that speed. Not while driving. She hadn't mentioned the rainbow or the missing teeth. Doris straightened in the back seat. Margaret didn't have to look to know her mother was just as alarmed. "Yes," Margaret said cautiously. "That's right." The rest of the drive was drenched in silence. Margaret watched Reed's eyes flick to the rearview mirror more than once. Each time she glanced up, he turned away. Was he watching her? Or the handbag? When they finally pulled up in front of Margaret's house, the tension inside the cab was stifling. "Here we are," Reed said, forcing a smile, "safe and sound." "Thank you again," Margaret replied, stepping out. "My pleasure. I'm in the phone book if you ever need anything. Reed Caraway." Doris and Margaret didn't speak until the front door was locked behind them. Margaret slumped into a chair, still holding the handbag. "Did you hear what he said?" Doris asked. "About the rainbow and the teeth?" Margaret nodded. "He couldn't have seen that. He barely looked at the photo." "You think he knew them?" Doris asked softly. "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "But something doesn't feel right." She turned the handbag over. If this was really Lucia's, there would be a mark, a name tag or sticker. "Remember how I labeled all her things?" "She hated it when you wrote inside this one," Doris said. "We used a sticker instead," Margaret murmured, opening the bag. Inside she saw a faint square of residue, the outline of something long gone, but once there. "She peeled the sticker off before school once," Margaret remembered. "I had to replace it that afternoon. This glue line, this is where it was." "Then this is Lucia's," Doris said, her voice trembling. "It has to be." "We need confirmation," Margaret said. "Someone who knows vintage items." "The antique shop on Burnett Road," Doris said quickly. "They'd know." Margaret nodded. "Let's go. If it's the 1984 Barbie bag, it confirms it." As they headed out, the weight of what they carried, this one small object, felt heavier than any burden they'd held in 16 years. It was more than a child's accessory. It was a key. In the car, as they drove toward Burnett Road, Margaret finally spoke. "If this really is Lucia's, it means she was alive long after she disappeared, and that someone close to her, or to Jim, had access to her things." Doris clutched the handbag tighter. "And we're finally getting close to the truth." Traffic moved at a steady pace as Margaret steered through Austin's mid-afternoon bustle. Inside the car, silence hung like a curtain, thick, uneasy, and weighted with the questions neither woman had been ready to voice. The blue handbag lay in Doris's lap, and her fingers absent-mindedly traced the white trim, as if trying to tease out the truth from its edges. "Do you really think it could be Lucia's?" Doris finally asked, her voice no more than a whisper. Margaret stared ahead, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mom. If it is hers, why would Reed have it? Why lie? Why hold on to it after all these years?" No answers came, just more questions. 20 minutes later, they turned into the parking lot of Burnett Antiques, a narrow storefront nestled between an old bakery and a faded hardware shop. The antique store had always been a charming throwback to another era, a place filled with the comforting scent of aged paper, polished wood, and the distant hum of jazz echoing from a radio near the register. A brass bell above the door chimed as they entered. The interior was cozy and eclectic. Glass cabinets lined the walls, housing everything from vintage brooches and watches to porcelain figurines. Larger items, chairs, mirrors, and carved side tables occupied the center of the room like a silent audience. Behind the counter stood Mr. Keller, a silver-hemmed man in his 60s with a waistcoat and an ever-present smile. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, what brings you in today?" "Hello, Mr. Keller," Margaret replied. "We were hoping you might help us identify something." Doris gently placed the handbag on the counter. Mr. Keller adjusted his glasses and peered at it with curiosity. "Now, that's an interesting little piece. Looks like a children's accessory." I'd place it somewhere in the early 80s, possibly part of a toy line, but I must confess it's not exactly my specialty." He turned and called through the curtain behind him. Moments later, a younger man emerged, mid-40s, salt and pepper hair and an air of precision. "Robert Kirkland," Mr. Keller introduced. "He handles all our vintage collectibles, especially toys. His wife collects Barbie memorabilia. If anyone can help, it's him." Robert gave a polite nod and carried the handbag over to a better-lit counter. "What are we looking to confirm?" he asked, slipping on a pair of gloves. "We believe it might be from the early 1980s Mattel Barbie accessory collection," Margaret explained. "We want to know if it's authentic and possibly when it was produced." Robert nodded, pulled out a jeweler's loupe and began a thorough inspection. He examined the vinyl surface, the white trim, the stitching, and the clasp. He unzipped it, checking the interior seams. "This material and stitch pattern are consistent with Mattel's Barbie accessories of that era," he confirmed. The color, a bright sky blue, was part of their 1983-84 limited run. Rare to see one in this condition. He flipped it over again and tapped the zipper. This pull tab, Mattel's signature shape, only used between 83 and 84. He paused. "Do you mind if I call my wife? She might confirm which line it belongs to." "Go ahead," Doris said quickly. While he stepped away, Margaret and Doris stood in tense silence. A few minutes later, Robert returned, smiling. "She's certain. It's from the 1983 limited edition, only produced for about 8 months. Margaret and Doris exchanged a look. It was a match, but Robert hadn't finished. "There's one odd thing," he said, pointing to the interior. "This tag, it's been tampered with." Margaret leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "This white ribbon tag here. Notice the puckering around the edges, and the discoloration?" He tilted it under the light. "That's not age. Someone applied heat, probably with an iron, to remove the printed information." "Could it have faded naturally?" Doris asked. Robert shook his head. "No. Fading affects the whole tag evenly. This is concentrated damage, exactly where the branding and date stamp would be. Someone tried to erase its identity." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "But why would anyone do that?" Robert's brow furrowed. "Could be to obscure ownership. Resale value increases if an item isn't marked, especially if stolen." Margaret swallowed hard. What if it was more than just resale? Robert paused. "Is there something specific about this item that concerns you?" Margaret hesitated, then offered a measured answer. "It looks exactly like a bag my daughter used to have. She vanished 16 years ago. We found this in someone's possession." Robert's eyes softened with sympathy. "I see. I can tell you this, it's authentic. My wife even recalled a catalog image with this exact style. And based on the damage to the tag, I'd say someone didn't want it traceable." Doris took the bag gently from the counter and held it against her chest. "Would you like to bring it back when my wife's in?" Robert offered. "She might remember more details." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick. "You've helped more than you know." As they walked out, the bell above the door jingled softly behind them. In the car, Margaret sat motionless for a moment before turning the key. He confirmed it. It's the real deal, and someone tried to hide it. Doris stared out the windshield. What else has been hidden? Margaret glanced down at the handbag. It no longer felt like a relic. It felt like a whisper from the past, a voice refusing to be silenced. And she was finally ready to listen. Once the door shut securely behind them and they were safely inside their home, the tension that had built up during the ride began to spill into the room like steam from a boiling pot. Margaret immediately turned the deadbolt with a firm twist. her heart still racing from everything they'd experienced over the last several hours. Doris removed her scarf and laid it on the entry table, then turned to her daughter with a grim, focused expression. "Margaret," she said quietly, her voice tinged with urgency. "Someone deliberately removed the identification tag from that handbag." Margaret sat down heavily on the nearest chair, the handbag nestled securely in her lap. Her fingers, now trembling, traced the faint outline of the small white ribbon tag inside, its surface clearly warped and damaged from deliberate tampering. "I know," she said. "This wasn't just wear and tear. Whoever had this wanted to erase where it came from, or who it belonged to." Doris stepped forward, her voice firm and unwavering. "We need to take this to the police. This, along with Jim's car showing up crushed in Reed's junkyard. It can't be ignored. There are too many coincidences, Margaret. Far too many." Margaret looked up slowly, her eyes reflecting the storm of thoughts in her mind. "Even if this isn't Lucha's exact bag," she said, her voice low, "even if somehow Reed's story is true and it came from his daughter's friend, the police still need to know. The destroyed label, the timing, the car, it's all too much." Doris nodded in agreement. "Then let's go now. We might still catch Detective Reyes before he leaves the station." Margaret stood, her grip tightening on the blue handbag. "Right, let's not waste any more time." They exited the house again, locking the door behind them, and quickly got into Margaret's sedan. The late afternoon sky had begun to fade, streaked with amber and dusky pink. Margaret started the car, mentally preparing herself for what could be a long evening at the station. She pulled onto the road, heading east through their neighborhood. But barely 10 minutes into their drive, something changed. A warning light suddenly flared to life on the dashboard. Bright red and unmistakable. "Brake," Margaret muttered aloud, eyebrows knitting. She pressed the pedal gently to test it, and felt an immediate difference. Too soft, almost no resistance. "What is it?" Doris asked, sitting upright in her seat. "The brake light just came on," Margaret said, tapping the pedal again. "And it feels wrong. Way too soft." The car began to lurch slightly, its smooth hum now replaced by a faint sputtering. Margaret's pulse quickened. She scanned the road ahead and saw a wide shoulder just before an approaching intersection. She scanned the road as she took a quick left. The smooth shoulder passed quickly, and a moment later, a lower. "We're pulling over," she said, signaling and guiding the car to a stop. It shuddered as she brought it to rest. She switched off the ignition, then tried to start it again. The engine coughed weakly, failing to catch. Margaret popped the hood and stepped out, her breath visible in the cooling air. She leaned over the engine, peering into its guts. Not that she expected to know what was wrong, but it felt like she had to do something. Nothing seemed out of place. No smoke, no odd smells, just a machine that had given up. Doris joined her, shivering slightly. "Should we call a tow truck?" she asked. "Yeah," Margaret sighed. "We're not getting anywhere like this." But just as she was reaching for her phone, the sound of a familiar truck engine reached them. A dusty silver pickup slowed to a stop behind their stalled car. It was Reed. He climbed out of the driver's side with a concerned expression, his tall companion from earlier stepping out on the passenger side. "Margaret, Mrs. Barrett," Reed called as he approached. "Everything all right? I was just coming back from a job and saw your car." Margaret forced a smile. "We're having some issues. The brake light came on and then it stalled." Reed peered under the hood. "This is Jason," he added, nodding to his companion. "He works on cars. Let him take a look." Jason gave a curt nod and leaned into the engine. "Describe what happened," he said. Margaret recapped the symptoms: the brake light, the mushy pedal, the stalling. Jason poked and prodded a few areas with calloused fingers before standing straight. "Brake fluid's leaking," he said. "Looks like it's already started affecting the transmission. You shouldn't drive it like this." "Can it be fixed?" Doris asked. "Not here," Jason said. "Needs a garage. Tools, parts." Reed stepped forward. "I can call a tow and have it brought to the junkyard. We've got what we need there. I'll fix it up myself, on the house." "That's generous," Margaret began, but Doris interrupted. "We were headed to the police station," she said pointedly. Reed paused. "Everything okay?" Margaret replied quickly, "Just following up on Jim's case." "Well," Reed said, already pulling out his phone, "I'll get a tow truck out here and we'll get this sorted. You can ride with us, and I'll have the car looked at while you take care of your business with the police." "We'd prefer to go to the station first," Doris insisted. "We can call Detective Reyes from the junkyard," Margaret said gently, trying to sound practical. Reed gave a friendly nod. "Good idea. I'll get my guy here." Within minutes, a flatbed tow truck with a different logo arrived. The driver said nothing as he hooked up Margaret's car. Reed turned back to the women. "You can ride with us. I'll get you home after." Doris didn't move at first. She stood behind the truck, her eyes locked on the license plate. "You coming?" Reed called from the cab, his tone light. "Yes, of course," Margaret replied, though her hand hesitated on the door handle. Doris finally moved to climb in, but not before she took one last, long look at the truck's rear plate, committing it to memory. Something about all of this was starting to feel very wrong. "Mom," Margaret called softly, holding open the truck's passenger door. With evident reluctance, Doris finally moved toward the vehicle, her posture stiff, her jaw clenched. As she climbed into the back seat, she leaned in close and whispered into Margaret's ear, her voice barely more than a breath, yet the weight behind it was unmistakable. "I don't like this," she said. "I've got a terrible feeling. We should have called the police for help instead of getting in this truck." Margaret gave her mother's hand a reassuring pat, trying to mask the unease now creeping up her own spine. But her mind was already chasing the same concerns. The timing of Reed's arrival had been disturbingly convenient, almost as though he'd been following them, and his insistence on returning them to the junkyard instead of the police station felt like something more than helpfulness. As they settled into the vehicle, Margaret cleared her throat and spoke with deliberate calm. "Actually, Reed," she said, her voice firm, "we've thought it over. It would be more helpful if you could take us directly to the police station instead of heading back to the junkyard." Reed paused, his fingers tightening slightly around the steering wheel. There was a brief, noticeable shift in his posture before he nodded, offering them a thin smile. "Sure," he said, "whatever you prefer." For a few minutes, the ride passed in silence, save for the gentle rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional turn of the tires along the asphalt. Margaret glanced sideways at her mother, who was now hunched slightly forward in the back seat. Her hands were concealed low in her lap, and her eyes were fixed downward, not on the road. It took Margaret a moment to realize what she was doing. She was texting. Very carefully, subtly, Doris was tapping out a message on her phone, shielding the screen from both Reed and his passenger Jason. Her movements were small and practiced, her face blank to anyone not paying close attention. Margaret's heart thudded. She didn't know who her mother had texted, but she prayed it was someone who could help. Roughly 15 minutes into the ride, Margaret began to notice the scenery outside had changed. The buildings were thinning, replaced by long stretches of scrub and empty lots. She leaned forward slightly, frowning at the unfamiliar roads. "Reed," she said, trying to keep her tone light, "this doesn't look like the way to the police station." Reed didn't look at her. "Shortcut," he replied curtly. "Less traffic this way." Margaret's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. Reed's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, and he did not smile. Jason, who had been unusually quiet until now, slowly turned in his seat to look back at them. The friendliness from earlier had vanished from his face, replaced by something cold and unreadable. "Reed," Doris said, her voice sharp with alarm. "Where are you taking us? This is not the way." Reed's jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. "Change of plans," he muttered, his voice colder than before. Margaret's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Without answering, Jason reached under his seat and pulled out a handgun. It was compact, dark, and fitted with what appeared to be a silencer. He held it with familiarity, as though he'd done so many times before. From beneath the seat he also retrieved 2 pairs of handcuffs. "Put these on," Jason ordered, extending the metal cuffs toward them. "Both of you, now." Margaret stared at the weapon, her mind whirling. "Reed, what is this? What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Put the handcuffs on," Jason snapped. His tone had hardened into something dangerous. As they hesitated, Jason slammed his fist against the dashboard, making both women flinch. "Now," he bellowed, "or I shoot." His outburst sent panic surging through Margaret's veins. Her hands shook as she took the cuffs and snapped them around her wrists, one loop at a time. Doris, pale and rigid, followed suit, her fingers trembling so badly that Margaret had to help her fasten the second cuff. Jason reached back and roughly tugged on their restraints, checking they were secure. Then he pulled 2 handkerchiefs from his pocket, wadded them up and shoved one into Margaret's mouth, then the other into Doris's, effectively gagging them. "The blue bag," Jason said, as he reached forward and grabbed it from Doris's lap. "Not yours anymore." He shoved Margaret harshly, forcing her to slide down to the floorboard in the back seat. Doris was pushed sideways, pinned against the door. Reed's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. They locked briefly with Margaret's, and whatever humanity might have once lived there was gone. His voice came out cold, devoid of pretense. "Be quiet," he said, "or you'll never see daylight again." The truck rumbled forward, leaving the main road behind. Margaret's breathing was shallow. The realization dawned that the blue handbag, something so seemingly innocent, was connected to something much darker. Reed was willing to abduct them, to keep it secret. What else might he do? She looked across the truck's floor at her mother. Doris's eyes found hers. Despite the gag, her gaze was calm and determined. She blinked once, slowly, meaningfully. Margaret understood. She had sent a message. Someone knew they were in trouble. The truck turned down a narrow dirt road flanked by tall cedar trees. It snaked and curved for miles, growing more isolated with every turn. As the last sliver of sunlight faded from the sky, the road finally opened into a clearing. In the clearing stood a run-down farmhouse, its white paint peeling, its porch sagging under its own weight. To the side was an old camper trailer, once white but now stained with grime. No lights were visible in nearby fields. They were far from any neighbors or help. Reed parked the truck near the farmhouse, killed the engine, and stepped out. Jason kept the gun pointed at the women while Reed opened the back door. "Out," he said, grabbing Margaret's arm and hauling her to her feet. Doris stumbled as she exited, her legs stiff from being folded in the seat. The 2 women were ushered toward the porch of the farmhouse, still bound and gagged. As they passed the camper, Margaret noticed it was rocking violently, as if someone inside was moving aggressively. Reed nudged Jason. "Boss is having a good time in there," he said, chuckling. Jason laughed. "Let's wait till he's done before dropping this mess on him." He shoved Margaret forward. These 2 are going to be a real headache. The porch creaked under their weight as they were guided into the house. The interior reeked of mildew and stale smoke. Junk and broken furniture lined the walls. They passed through the living room and into a narrow hallway leading to a small office space. Inside, a man sat by a window. He was older, with thinning gray hair and a face that had seen too many winters. He looked up from a newspaper, but didn't speak. "Watch them," Reed told the man. "We're grabbing food before we deal with the boss." Jason removed the gags but not the cuffs. "Don't talk to them," he told the older man. "Same rules as always." Reed produced a thick chain from his coat and used it to fasten the women's handcuffs to a heavy radiator in the corner of the room. Once the door shut behind them with a decisive thud and the faint jingle of keys turning in the lock, Margaret and Doris were left alone with the older man. Micah. The faint click of the bolt locking them in echoed ominously in the dim room, and for a few long seconds no one spoke. Margaret's heartbeat thudded in her ears as she took in the cluttered office space, the outdated computer on the desk, the overflowing filing cabinets, and the thick coating of dust on the Venetian blinds. Micah resumed his place by the window, picking up his newspaper, though it was clear he wasn't reading. Margaret saw her chance and leaned forward, her voice hushed but urgent. "Please, please help us," she pleaded, struggling to keep her panic at bay. "We're not criminals. We haven't done anything wrong." Doris followed her daughter's cue, her voice shaky but firm with determination. "My granddaughter is a police detective," she said, her eyes locked on Micah's weathered face. "She's going to come looking for us, and if you help us now, the police will go easier on you. Please." Micah didn't respond at first. His eyes remained on the page in front of him, though they didn't move. It was obvious he wasn't reading the words, but rather considering something, perhaps weighing the risk of defying his companions. Margaret's voice cracked. "We're just trying to find out what happened to my daughter and my husband. They disappeared 16 years ago. That's all we want. To know the truth, to bring them home if we still can." Still no answer. But his hand, which held the paper, had begun to tremble slightly. They continued, taking turns, their pleas building in intensity, their stories overlapping, desperate and heartfelt. The room was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. At one point, Micah's eyes flicked toward the closed door, concern etching deeper into the creases of his lined face. Then came a flicker of something in his gaze, a softening, almost imperceptible. And finally he spoke, though his voice was little more than a gravelly whisper. "They call her Samantha here," he muttered, his eyes not leaving the floor. "But I knew that wasn't her name. It was Lucia. That's what they called her. Before." The air seemed to leave Margaret's lungs all at once. Her knees buckled, and she sank heavily onto the floor, stunned. "She's here," she managed, her voice barely more than a breath. "My Lucia. She's alive." Micah nodded once, sharp and small. "They changed her name 4 years ago, started calling her Samantha, said it'd help her forget." His voice was bitter. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "You can see we're not like them. You're not like them either. You can help us." "You don't know what they're capable of," he said grimly, shaking his head. "I've seen what happens to people who cross them. I'd be a dead man if they caught me helping you." Doris took a different approach, her voice soft, wise, full of conviction. "Sir, the years left to us are short. What we do now, this is what will follow us into the next world. Please, do what's right. Help us, and we'll never forget it." A long silence followed, Micah clearly waging a war inside himself. Then footsteps echoed in the hallway. He tensed, frozen in place. "Please," Doris whispered again. "Please." Micah seemed to come to a decision. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted toward the door. With a swift motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a flip phone, old but still functioning. His fingers trembled as he dialed. 911, he whispered into the receiver. "There's a farmhouse outside of Driftwood off County Road 163. White paint. red camper out back. 2 women being held hostage. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket just as the doorknob began to turn. Margaret didn't even have time to whisper a thank you before the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't just Reed or Jason, it was someone else. A hulking man entered the room wearing a stained white tank top and boxers, his thick limbs covered in faded tattoos and bristly hair. His presence was overwhelming, the stench of sweat and something more foul clinging to him. His face was angular and cruel, with eyes that didn't blink often enough. Micah stood quickly, his posture stiff, every trace of defiance erased from his face. "They were making noise," he said quickly. "I was just quieting them down." The new man, clearly the one Reed and Jason referred to as the boss, narrowed his eyes. "You're not supposed to talk to them. You know the rules." Scarcely hissed. Didn't say nothing useful," Micah muttered, stepping back. The boss didn't look convinced. "Search him," he barked to Reed and Jason, who had followed him into the room. Margaret's blood ran cold. If he's got anything suspicious, deal with him. The threat hung in the air, like a guillotine. Reed nodded and ushered Micah out of the room, leaving Margaret and Doris alone with Jason and the terrifying boss. As the door shut again, the boss stepped closer to them, his eyes crawling over their forms. "So," he said, a disturbing grin spreading across his face. "Red tells me you're here for Samantha." He reached out and brushed Margaret's hair back from her face, then leaned in to sniff it. The gesture made her want to retch. "I like older women," he said, his voice heavy with implication. Margaret yanked away, her handcuffs clanging against the radiator. "Give her back to us," she shouted, all fear overridden by rage and desperation. He laughed, a horrible, rattling sound that reverberated through the room. "You want to see her?" he said. "Fine. Let's play a game." He motioned to Jason, who left and returned moments later with 3 young women. They were in their mid-20s, all thin, with long brown hair. Each looked frightened and kept their eyes cast down, as if trained not to make eye contact. "Here's how this works," the boss said, licking his lips. "Pick which one is Samantha. No talking, no discussion. You both point at the same time. If you pick the same girl, and if you're right, you get to see her. That's all." Margaret's heart pounded wildly. She stared at the 3 women, desperately searching their faces for something familiar. And then she saw it. A faint scar just above the right eyebrow of the woman in the center. The same scar Lucia had gotten when she fell off her bike at age 6. "Well, and 2-3, the boss said, his grin widening. Both women lifted their cuffed hands and pointed to the same woman, the one with the scar. The boss's crude laughter reverberated through the cramped room, thick with stale smoke and dread. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, rubbing his bristled chin as if genuinely impressed. "Family really can sniff each other out, can't they?" He gestured dismissively toward the other 2 young women. "Take these 2 away. No need for them now." Jason stepped forward without a word, his face devoid of expression, and ushered the 2 silent girls out of the room. As they disappeared into the hallway, the boss turned his full attention back to Margaret, Doris, and the girl they had both just pointed to, the one with the small, barely visible scar above her right eyebrow. The one they believed, with every fiber of their beings, was Lucia. "Lucia!" Margaret breathed, her voice a tremulous mix of hope and devastation. She took a cautious step forward, barely able to speak past the knot in her throat. "Sweetheart, is it really you?" But the young woman did not respond. She didn't move. Her chin stayed low, her gaze a million miles away, locked in some inner landscape where no voice could reach her. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. She was present in body, but in spirit she seemed far, far away. "Now for the real fun," the boss announced, rubbing his hands together like a grotesque parody of anticipation. His eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure. "Samantha, strip." The command sliced through the air like a knife. Both Margaret and Doris recoiled in horror. "No!" Margaret cried out, her voice shrill and raw. "Please don't do this to her." "Leave her alone," Doris added, her voice thick with trembling rage. "She's just a girl." The boss didn't flinch. His focus was solely on the blank-faced woman before him. "I said, strip, now." To Margaret's growing horror, the young woman began to move. Slowly, mechanically, her hands reached up to unbutton the simple blouse she wore. There was no protest in her body, no sign of resistance. She moved like someone who had done this before. Too many times. "That's it," the boss muttered with a satisfied grunt. Then, as if struck by sudden inspiration, he raised his hand. "Wait, I have a better idea." He turned his eyes toward Margaret, a cruel grin spreading across his unshaven face. "More flavors would be nice," he murmured, walking toward her. "No, please," Margaret began, but he was already unlocking the chain from the radiator, leaving her wrist still bound in the metal cuffs. He seized her roughly by the arm and dragged her toward the center of the room, pushing her between Doris and Samantha. "I like older women too," he said with a vile smirk, dragging a filthy finger along her cheek. "Samantha, strip her for me." "Lucia," Margaret gasped, locking eyes with the young woman. "Lucia, I'm your mother. It's me. Please, don't do this." For a fleeting moment, something flickered behind Samantha's otherwise vacant eyes, a twitch of recognition, or perhaps confusion, but it vanished just as quickly as it came. She stepped toward Margaret, her hands twitching awkwardly. Margaret backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. "Don't let them make you do this, please. You're not Samantha. You're Lucia Halbrook. You're my daughter." The boss tightened his grip on her arm. "I like to play with my prey before I consume them," he sneered, and with one swift, violent tug, he tore the fabric of Margaret's blouse, exposing her shoulder. "Oh!" Margaret cried out, more in terror than in pain, as his hand groped toward her exposed skin. But before he could do more, the door slammed open with a thunderous crash. "Boss!" Reed shouted, breathless and panicked. "The police! They're outside!" The room froze. The boss turned, releasing Margaret, his lust twisted into fury. "What? How the hell did they find us?" "They've surrounded the place," Reed yelled, sweat streaking down his face. The boss let out a savage curse and grabbed Samantha's arm, pulling her toward him. "We're leaving, now." "There's no way out," Reed said, his voice tight. "They've got every side covered." Snarling, the boss yanked the pistol from Reed's waistband and turned it on Margaret. "Then I'll handle this myself." He took a step forward, raising the weapon. 2 sharp gunshots split the air. Micah burst through the open door, throwing himself in front of Margaret. The bullets struck him square in the chest. He crumpled instantly, blood soaking through his shirt in deep, spreading blossoms. "No!" Doris screamed. The boss aimed again, but the gun clicked, empty. "Damn it!" he roared, flinging the weapon to the floor. "Give me another." But it was too late. Wood splintered in the hallway and voices shouted, "Police, drop your weapons." Officers swarmed the room, their weapons raised. Reed and Jason threw their hands up in surrender. The boss lunged toward an officer, but before he could reach him, another shot rang out. He staggered, a bullet tearing through his thigh. Another struck his shoulder. This time he dropped, clutching at the wounds, but still grinning like a madman. "Do you know how many bullets I've taken in my life?" he spat, laughing through the pain. "You'll have to try harder than that." A third shot knocked him onto his back. He didn't move again. Paramedics rushed in behind the officers. One immediately dropped beside Micah, trying to stem the bleeding. Margaret, her hands shaking, was quickly freed by a female officer. Waited. She stumbled to Samantha's side. "Lucia," she whispered, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "It's me. It's Mom. You're safe now." Lucia did not respond. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, remained fixed on something far away. Her body trembled, but her mind remained locked in a place Margaret could not yet reach. Doris, released from her own restraints, ran to join them. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her granddaughter. "We found her," she sobbed. "Oh my God, Margaret, we found her." As officers secured the criminals and paramedics treated the wounded, the farmhouse was lit up in a swirl of red and blue lights. Margaret sat on the cold floor, holding Lucia, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Whatever horrors had happened here, whatever evil they had faced, this one truth remained. Lucia was alive. And she wasn't going to lose her again. The boss's harsh laughter echoed through the room like a predator savoring the fear in his prey. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, clapping his hands once, mockingly. "Family really can tell each other apart, can't they?" His eyes glittered with something dark and malicious. He waved dismissively toward the other two women. "Take these two away." Jason stepped forward without hesitation, grabbing the arms of the women on the right and left. Neither resisted, their heads bowed low, eyes glassy with resignation. The door closed behind them with a dull thud, leaving only Margaret, Doris, the boss, and the young woman they had pointed to, Lucia, or rather, Samantha, as she had been renamed by these monsters. "Lucia," Margaret whispered, her voice a tremulous gasp, barely more than a breath. She stepped forward, heart pounding, tears springing to her eyes. "Sweetheart, is it really you?" But the young woman didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes remained hollow, her posture unmoving. Her soul, it seemed, had long since fled. The boss turned to her with a sneer. "Let's have a little fun now, shall we?" His tone had shifted, darkened. He took a slow step forward, eyes locked on Samantha. "Strip," he ordered, the single word cutting through the room like a whip. "No," Margaret cried, her heart lurching with horror. "Please, don't do this to her." "Leave her alone," Doris added, her voice trembling but fierce, rising with a surge of maternal rage. "She's our granddaughter. Haven't you done enough?" The boss ignored them, as if they were no more than background noise. His gaze remained fixed on Samantha. "You heard me, strip. Now." Margaret watched in agony as her daughter, Lucia Samantha, began to move. Her hands reached for the hem of her shirt, her movements slow and robotic. She was numb, as if detached from her body, performing an action that had long since lost its meaning. "That's it," the boss crooned, leaning forward. But then he paused, grinning cruelly. "Wait. I've got a better idea." His eyes slid back toward Margaret. "More flavors might be nice today." Before Margaret could react, the boss grabbed her arm and yanked her away from Doris. He unlocked her chain from the radiator, though the cuffs remained on her wrists. With a rough shove, he positioned her in the center of the room, between Samantha and Doris. "I like older women, too," he sneered, his thick fingers brushing Margaret's cheek. She flinched at his touch, disgust and terror churning in her gut. "Samantha," he said, turning to the vacant young woman, "strip her." "Lucia, don't," Margaret pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, sweetheart. It's me. It's Mom. Look at me." Samantha's hands twitched at her sides. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, faint recognition, pain, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She stepped forward, obeying the command like an automaton. Margaret tried to back away, but the boss held her tightly. "I like to play with my prey before I consume them," he said, chuckling, then grabbed the shoulder of Margaret's blouse and ripped the fabric, exposing her collarbone. Margaret screamed, not from pain but sheer helplessness. Her knees buckled, but the boss held her up, his hands now roaming. The door crashed open. "Boss!" Reed burst in, panting, panic etched on his face. "Police! They're outside! They've surrounded the place!" The boss's expression twisted from lust to fury. "How the hell did they find us?" Reed's voice cracked. "I don't know, but they've got the perimeter locked down. We're trapped." The boss shoved Margaret aside. She fell hard to the floor, scraping her elbow against the wood. He whirled on Reed. "Then we'll make a run for it. We take the women and go through the back." "There's no way out," Reed stammered. "They've got it sealed." The boss's snarl was inhuman. He yanked a gun from Reed's waistband and turned it on Margaret, who was trying to crawl toward Doris. "I'll do it myself then," he growled, raising the weapon. Before he could pull the trigger, the older man, Micah, burst in. "No!" he shouted and lunged forward. 2 shots rang out, deafening in the small room. Micah collapsed to the floor, blood gushing from his chest and stomach. Margaret screamed. The boss aimed again, but the gun clicked. Empty. "Damn it," he shouted, throwing the weapon across the room. "Give me another one." But before Jason could move, the sound of a battering ram splitting wood filled the house. "Police, drop your weapons!" Within seconds, armed officers stormed in. Weapons drawn, they shouted orders. "Hands up! Get down!" Jason and Reed raised their hands. The boss didn't. Instead, he charged at the nearest officer with a wild scream. 2 more shots rang out. The boss staggered, clutching his leg. A 3rd shot hit his shoulder, and he fell, snarling like a wounded animal. Handcuffs clicked shut around wrists. Shouts echoed. The chaos blurred into noise. A female officer rushed to Margaret, who was still on the floor. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" "I'm fine," she gasped, pointing toward her daughter. "Lucia, my daughter." Doris, now free, had already rushed to Samantha. She knelt and cradled the young woman's face in her hands. "Lucia, baby, it's us. We're here. You're safe now." Samantha didn't react. Her eyes were open, her body limp. A shell. Margaret joined them, embracing them both. "I have you. I have you," she sobbed over and over. Paramedics swarmed in to tend to Micah, who lay bleeding but breathing. Officers dragged the 3 captors from the house. Reed didn't say a word. Jason glanced at Margaret once before ducking his head. The boss, grinning despite his wounds, was laughing as he was loaded into a cruiser. "You'll never bring her back. She's mine, mine." Officers forced him down, slamming the door. Outside, the farmhouse bathed in red and blue lights, the night still warm and thick with tension. Medics tended to Doris's wrists. Another checked Margaret's vitals. "She needs trauma support," one said, referring to Samantha. "Immediate care." Margaret didn't let go of her daughter, even as the ambulance doors opened. "She's not Samantha," she whispered fiercely to anyone who'd listen. "Her name is Lucia, my Lucia." Doris stood behind her, one hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We got her back," she whispered, her voice broken. "After all these years, we found her." Margaret nodded. "And now, we bring her home." Margaret allowed herself to be led away from the scene, her eyes never straying from Samantha, Lucia, who sat wrapped in a thick blanket on a stretcher. Paramedics attended to her, but she remained motionless, staring at a spot only she could see. Her face, pale and expressionless, looked so familiar and yet so hauntingly distant. "You have a small laceration on your shoulder," the paramedic attending Margaret said gently, dabbing at the torn fabric where the boss had grabbed her. It doesn't require stitches, but we'll clean and bandage it to avoid infection." Margaret barely registered the words. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is she all right?" The paramedic followed her gaze toward Lucia. "Physically, she appears uninjured," she replied with a note of caution. "But she hasn't spoken. She hasn't even acknowledged us. Psychological trauma is very likely. A doctor will examine her more thoroughly once we reach the hospital." Margaret nodded numbly, allowing the bandage to be wrapped and a warm blanket draped over her shoulders. Across the yard, Doris was finishing her own examination. Her face looked drawn, exhausted from the ordeal, but her movements were purposeful as she made her way back to her daughter. "How is she?" Doris asked quietly, eyes locked on Lucia. "In shock," Margaret replied, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "She doesn't recognize us, Mom. She just stares, like she's not even here." "Give her time," Doris said, placing a steadying hand on Margaret's arm. 16 years of horror. She'll need time to find her way back. Just then, a rush of motion near the farmhouse caught their attention. Paramedics were sprinting a stretcher toward an ambulance, and Margaret saw the older man, Micah, being rushed inside. His shirt was soaked in blood, and a medic held an IV bag aloft as others worked to stabilize him. "We need to move now," a paramedic shouted to his team. "He's lost a lot of blood. Internal bleeding suspected. We can't wait." As they loaded Micah into the ambulance, a young officer approached Margaret and Doris. "The medics want to transport your daughter to the hospital right away," he informed them. "They also recommend you both undergo further evaluation." "Of course," Marguerite replied, her eyes never leaving the ambulance door. "That man, Micah, he saved my life. Will he survive?" "They're doing everything they can," the officer said neutrally, but with a hint of hope. "He's strong and was still conscious when they began treatment." As they walked toward the second ambulance, another paramedic came up, looking somewhat hesitant. "Before we leave," he said, "I thought you should know. Micah spoke to us while we were stabilizing him. He identified himself as Micah Carraway." Margaret stopped mid-step. "Carraway? Reed's last name?" The paramedic nodded. "He said Reed is his son, and apparently the man you called the boss, Charlie Carnes, is Micah's stepbrother." Doris stared in disbelief. His own son betrayed him, aligned himself with a monster. The paramedic's face was solemn. "Micah said he had no idea until recently how deeply involved Reed was with Carnes. He said he only stayed on the property to protect anyone he could from inside." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. "We owe him everything," she said softly, "and so does Lucia." They climbed into the ambulance next to Lucia, who sat upright but completely still. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers gently curled as if she had forgotten how to move them. Her face remained vacant, and even when Margaret reached out and gently brushed her hand, there was no reaction. "Lucia," Margaret whispered, "we're here, sweetheart. You're safe now. We're going to take you home." Still, there was no flicker of recognition, no blink, no shift. Just a silent stare at something unseen. The drive to the hospital was a blur of sirens and rhythmic beeping. When they arrived, Lucia was whisked away for psychiatric evaluation, and Margaret and Doris were taken to a separate room for extended care. Doctors examined them both, treating minor injuries and offering support. Eventually, they were moved to a quiet consultation room to await updates. Margaret sat in the chair, still wrapped in the paramedic's blanket. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers clinging to the edge of the fabric as if anchoring herself to the present. "I still can't believe we found her," she said, barely above a whisper. "It feels unreal," Doris agreed, sitting beside her. "Like we've stepped into some twisted dream. But she's here. That's what matters. We found her." Margaret nodded slowly. But what kind of life has she lived? What did they do to her? Her voice caught. Will she ever come back to us? Before Doris could respond, the door opened and Detective Reyes entered, his face serious but visibly relieved to see them both unharmed. Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, he said, I'm so glad to see you safe. This day has taken an incredible toll. Have you been able to speak with my daughter? Margaret asked immediately. Not yet. The doctors are conducting a full psychological assessment. She hasn't spoken a word since being found. What about Micah? Doris asked quickly. The man who helped us? He's in surgery, Reyes replied. They're optimistic. He lost a lot of blood, but the bullets missed any vital organs. The doctors think he'll pull through. Margaret exhaled slowly, relief tempered by worry. He's a hero. If not for him, and the others? Doris pressed. Reed? That monster Carnes? All in custody, Reyes confirmed. We've already started processing evidence from the farmhouse and the junkyard. We've recovered the blue handbag and are running forensic analysis. Did Reed or Jason say anything? Margaret asked. About Jim? About what happened 16 years ago? We're still sorting through it all, Reyes replied carefully. But here's what we know so far. Reed's been cooperating. Somewhat. He says Charlie Carnes brought Jim and Lucia to the property 16 years ago. Claims Jim tried to protect Lucia, but was separated from her by force. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. So Jim didn't abandon us? No, Reyes said firmly. According to what we've gathered, Jim fought to the end. Carnes has a history. He's been on multiple watch lists, a serial predator. He changes names, builds isolated operations, and surrounds himself with loyal but desperate followers. And Lucia? Doris asked, her voice cracking. Did Reed say what happened to her all this time? She was renamed, stripped of her identity, and kept in psychological captivity. Carnes manipulated her with fear, trauma, and dependence. It's miraculous she's alive. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. But now she's free. Yes, Reyes said gently, and she'll need time to heal. But she has you. That's what matters most now. He almost believed they were phantoms from the past, Detective Morales explained with a heavy expression. Reed told us he was just 10 years old when it all happened, she continued, was traveling with Charlie, his step-uncle, who he idolized. Charlie in Reed's eyes was everything his biological father Micah wasn't. Dominant, fearless, and cunning. Micah was seen as weak and insignificant in Reed's eyes, someone unable to provide or protect. Charlie exploited that, feeding Reed's yearning for male guidance. The detective checked her notes. Reed said they were near Marble Falls when they spotted your husband's red Cadillac parked outside a roadside diner. Charlie staged it perfectly. He and Reed posed as hitchhikers in distress. Charlie told Jim that Reed was sick and they needed to reach a hospital. Naturally, your husband stopped to help them. Margaret covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. That was exactly who Jim was. Kind-hearted, trusting, always willing to help strangers without hesitation. Jim even went so far as to get them their own room at the motel in Llano. Morales added, her tone darkening. That night, after a shared dinner at a local diner, Charlie spiked Jim's drink. Once Lucia was asleep, he strangled your husband in the motel bathroom. A sharp gasp escaped Doris. Margaret grasped her mother's hand tightly, trying to steady herself. Charlie then staged the room to make it look like Jim left voluntarily, packed up Lucia, and told her her father had to be rushed to a hospital. They left in a car Charlie had hidden nearby. Over time, he manipulated Lucia, telling her that not only had her father died, but that her mother had abandoned her too. With forged documents and frequent moves, he successfully kept her hidden, changing her identity to Samantha. It Margaret's voice trembled. What about Jim's body? What happened to him? Reed and his friend helped clean the scene, the detective replied softly. Charlie disposed of Jim's body in a remote limestone sinkhole. Then they drove the Cadillac deep into the woods and abandoned it, where it remained hidden for years. How did it end up at the junkyard now? Doris asked. Morales sighed. That was Reed again. Recently he decided it was time to eliminate all connections to that night. He retrieved the car and brought it to the junkyard, intending to crush it. Believing that 16 years had distanced them enough from suspicion. Margaret sat frozen, her heart crushed under the weight of the revelations. The very night they disappeared, Jim had been murdered, and Lucia stolen from her life, forced into a nightmare that lasted over a decade. We're going to do everything we can to recover your husband's remains, Morales said quietly. Reed has given us a location our team is already investigating. Before Margaret could respond, the hospital door opened and a doctor stepped in. Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, he began gently. Your daughter has been moved to a private room. She's stable, but nonverbal. Having you nearby may help her recovery. They followed the doctor through softly lit hallways until they reached a quiet room. Lucia lay on a hospital bed, her face pale, her expression vacant. A thick blanket covered her, but she still looked impossibly small. Margaret approached carefully. Lucia, she said, voice trembling. It's Mom. Grandma Doris is here too. There was no response. Lucia stared at the ceiling, unmoving, as though she hadn't heard her mother's voice at all. But Margaret didn't stop. She continued softly recounting old bedtime stories, holidays, even little inside jokes that only Lucia would know. Doris soon joined in, recalling stories of baking cookies and family road trips. As the minutes passed, the hospital room filled with whispers of the past, memories of a life that had once been whole. And then, just when Margaret was losing hope, Lucia's lips moved. I'm sorry for being so broken, she whispered, voice scratchy from disuse. Tears ran down Margaret's cheeks. Sweetheart, you have nothing to be sorry for. None of this was your fault. I miss Daddy, Lucia said. A single tear slid down her cheek. Her voice was small, childlike, and broken, yet hearing her say Daddy filled the room with both sorrow and fragile hope. Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead. I miss him too. Moments later, a nurse peeked into the room. Excuse me? Mr. Carraway's asking to see you. He's just down the hall. Margaret hesitated, not wanting to leave, but Doris touched her arm. I'll stay. Go see him. Margaret nodded and followed the nurse to another room where Micah Carraway lay in bed, his chest swathed in thick bandages. He looked weak, but his eyes were clear. Mrs. Holbrook, he said softly, I wanted to apologize for my son, for staying silent for so long. Margaret sat beside his bed. You saved our lives, she said gently. If not for your courage, we might never have found Lucia. Micah swallowed hard. My son always despised kindness, saw it as weakness. When he and Charlie pretended to be helpless, they targeted your husband because he was compassionate. I understand now, Margaret whispered. Micah's lips trembled. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know. I tried to do the right thing. Finally. Margaret squeezed his hand. There is nothing to forgive. Later she returned to Lucia's room. Her daughter had fallen asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Doris sat beside her, brushing strands of hair from her face. Margaret took the other chair and reached for her daughter's hand. 16 years of heartbreak had led them here, to this moment of peace. There was still a long road ahead, therapy, healing, facing the past, but they would walk it together. Margaret looked down at Lucia's sleeping face and whispered, Welcome home, my baby. We never stopped looking.